The room felt wrong before anyone spoke. Not loud wrong. Not chaotic. It was the quiet kind. The kind that settles into your chest and refuses to move. Chairs were occupied, papers aligned, cups untouched. Every sound had weight. Every breath felt noticed. I remember becoming aware of my own hands, how still they were, how tightly my fingers pressed against each other as if movement itself might draw attention. No one looked at anyone else for long. Eyes drifted, stopped, shifted. There was a shared understanding that something fragile existed in that silence, and no one wanted to be the one to break it. A clock marked time somewhere beyond the walls, each second landing like a soft knock that went unanswered. I stood where I always stood, close enough to hear everything, far enough to be ignored. That position came with a certain invisibility, a permission to exist without being acknowledged. It was useful. It was dangerous. It meant you noticed things others didn't bother to see. A man cleared his throat and stopped himself halfway through, as if reconsidering the sound. Another adjusted his posture, then froze, realizing the movement had been unnecessary. The air carried the faint smell of metal and paper, and something older. Dust, perhaps, or the residue of long nights that never truly ended. No one smiled. No one joked. There was none of the forced ease that sometimes pretends things are normal when they are not. This time, the pretense had been abandoned. What replaced it was heavier. I remember thinking that the silence felt rehearsed, not planned but practiced, as if everyone in that room had learned over time that quiet was safer than questions, that waiting was preferable to knowing. My pulse was slow but deliberate. Each beat seemed to echo inside my ears. I focused on breathing without sound, on standing without shifting my weight. I had learned that stillness could make you disappear, that disappearing was sometimes the only way to survive a room like that. There were documents on the table. I did not read them. I didn't need to. The way they lay, untouched, perfectly placed, said more than words ever could. Decisions like this were rarely written for understanding. They were written for formality. Someone leaned back slightly, then forward again, as if testing the moment. The chair did not creak. Even the furniture seemed to cooperate with the silence. I felt it then. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The kind that arrives without explanation. A sense that whatever was about to happen had already begun, even if no one had said it out loud yet. And as I stood there, watching faces carefully avoid each other, I realized the most unsettling truth of all. The decision was already in the room. We were just waiting for it to speak. It was only later that I understood how ordinary the place was meant to feel. The building had been repurposed so many times that its original purpose had been thick walls, narrow corridors, windows placed high enough to admit light without offering the kind of structure designed to endure, not to inspire. Outside, the world was engaged in something vast and grinding, but inside, everything moved at a slower, more deliberate pace, as if time itself had been reassigned different priorities. By then, the war had already settled into people's routines, not into their hearts, those had hardened, but into their habits. Men arrived at the same hours each day. Boots echoed along the same hallways. Doors opened, closed, locked, unlocked, and closed again. The repetition created the illusion of control. Familiarity disguised the pressure. I belonged to that rhythm without truly belonging to the men who shaped it. I had a desk, a chair, a place to stand when meetings like this one took place. I carried messages that were never meant for me, transcribed words I was not expected to question, and waited in silence while others decided what silence would cost. Rank was visible in the smallest ways. In who spoke first, in who waited, in who leaned back without consequence, and who remained upright no matter how long the discussion dragged on. I learned to read these signals early, because failing to notice them carried its own risks. The room itself reinforced those distinctions. The table was long but narrow, forcing proximity without intimacy. Seats closer to the center were claimed without discussion. Others, like mine, existed at the edges, positions of utility rather than authority. From there, you could hear everything, but you were never expected to contribute. Maps were mounted on the walls, updated constantly, though no one studied them for long anymore. They had become background. Markings shifted, lines moved, pins were replaced. None of it felt permanent. Nothing did. What I noticed most in those days was how rarely people asked questions out loud. Clarifications were requested in private, or not at all. There was an unspoken agreement that too much curiosity could be interpreted as hesitation. Hesitation, in turn, was dangerous. Conversations before meetings were quiet and brief. Weather, schedules, logistics mentioned without detail. Once inside the room, even those small exchanges stopped. The door closed, and with it, any remaining softness was sealed away. There was always a moment, never acknowledged, when everyone adjusted to the absence of interruption. No phones, no messengers, no outside voices. Just the contained pressure of people who knew their words would not leave the room unless they were carried deliberately. I remember noticing how tired everyone, though no one mentioned it. Not the visible exhaustion of sleepless nights, but something deeper, a fatigue that came from carrying decisions long before making them, from understanding, even vaguely, that some choices could not be undone once spoken. My role required proximity, without presence. I stood behind the chairs, slightly to one side, close enough to hear instructions, far enough to avoid eye contact. It was a practiced position. I had been in it many times before. But this time, the atmosphere resisted settling into routine. There was a sense of compression, as if the room were smaller than it had been yesterday, as if the air itself had been measured and found insufficient. When someone shifted, others noticed. When someone paused too long before speaking, the silence stretched unnaturally. No one announced the importance of the meeting. They never did. Importance was understood by who had been summoned, by the absence of anyone who might ask unnecessary questions, by the way the door was guarded once it closed. I remember thinking that the building had heard conversations like this before, that its walls had absorbed words that had changed lives far beyond their reach. The structure did not react. It did not warn. It simply held the sound. And standing there, watching men take their places as if following a script written long ago, I felt the first clear certainty of the day. Whatever was about to be said would not stay contained within these walls. The shift was subtle at first. It began with what was not said. Voices remained low, controlled, almost careful. Words were chosen the way one might step across thin ice, testing, retreating, advancing again. When someone spoke, others listened without interruption, but not with ease. There was an awareness beneath the attention, a shared understanding that this was not a discussion meant to explore options. It was a process of narrowing. I noticed how often sentences ended without conclusions. Statements were offered, then left suspended, as if their implications were too heavy to land all at once. No one rushed to finish another man's thought. No one challenged them either. Disagreement, when it existed, was expressed through silence rather than speech. Eyes returned repeatedly to the same spot on the table. A document remained unopened. It was placed deliberately, its position slightly off-center, close enough to be reached without effort. Each time someone glanced at it, their expression tightened, just briefly, before smoothing again. I found myself paying attention to pauses, not the natural ones, but the deliberate pauses. Moments where someone could have spoken and chose not to. Those silences carried more weight than the words that surrounded them. They suggested awareness. They suggested doubt. I had learned, over time, that hesitation rarely belonged to those with the power to decide. It belonged to those who understood the cost of clarity. The room grew warmer, or perhaps my awareness sharpened. Jackets were adjusted, then left alone. A hand pressed flat against the table, fingers spread, as if anchoring its owner in place. Someone inhaled deeply through their nose, then released the breath slowly, deliberately. There were references to timelines, but never specifics. To readiness, but not readiness for what. To necessity, without naming what made it necessary. Each phrase circled the same point without approaching it directly. I realized, with a quiet sense of unease, that I understood the shape of what was coming before I understood its details. That recognition did not come from intelligence or insight, but from proximity, from standing close enough to hear the strain in certain voices, the forced neutrality in others. One man spoke longer than the rest. His tone never wavered, but his eyes did. They flicked briefly toward the unopened document, then away again. When he finished, no one responded immediately. The silence that followed was not uncertainty, it was acknowledgement. I felt something tighten in my chest then, a pressure that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with inevitability. The kind that settles in when you realize that the moment you were waiting for is not approaching. It has already arrived. I considered, briefly, whether my presence mattered at all, whether standing where I stood made me complicit or merely irrelevant. The thought passed quickly. There was no space for philosophy and only awareness. I became conscious of my own restraint, of the effort it took to keep my face neutral, my posture unchanged. I knew better than to react. Reactions were noticed, noted, remembered. The conversation continued, but it no longer felt like movement. It felt like confirmation. Each exchange removed another layer of uncertainty, though nothing concrete had been named. The room was converging on something singular, unavoidable. No one asked whether it should be done, only whether it could. And as that distinction settled into the space between us, I understood something that others either ignored or refused to face. The decision, when it came, would not surprise anyone, but it would still change everything. When the words finally came, they did not arrive with force. There was no raised voice, no emphasis, no dramatic pause beforehand. They were spoken at the same volume as everything else that morning, in the same measured tone, as if the speaker were confirming a routine detail rather than crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. The room did not react immediately. That, more than anything, is what I remember. The sentence ended, and the sound of it lingered in the air, unfinished. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the subtle gestures that had accompanied earlier exchanges, shifting weight, adjusting cuffs, touching the edge of the table, stopped completely. I felt the words register in stages, first as sound, then as meaning, finally, as consequence. The man who spoke did not look up when he finished. His gaze remained fixed on the table, on the same place where the unopened document. It was as if eye contact might have made the decision real in a way he was not ready to acknowledge. Someone else nodded once. A small movement, almost imperceptible. It was not agreement so much as recognition, a confirmation that the sentence had been heard and understood. No objections followed, not because there were none to make, but because objections would have required someone to claim ownership of the outcome. Silence was safer. Silence allowed the decision to belong to the room, rather than to any one person. I remember noticing how ordinary the language had been, how carefully neutral. There was nothing in the words themselves to suggest finality. If you heard them out of context, they might have sounded procedural, even restrained. That was what made them dangerous. The air felt heavier after, as if the room had absorbed something it could no longer release. Breathing became conscious again. Each inhale felt deliberate. Each exhale carried weight. No one wrote anything down right away. Pens remained still, pages untouched. There was a shared understanding that recording the decision too quickly would make it irreversible in a way that even speaking it had not yet achieved. I stood where I was, hands clasped, eyes forward. I did not look at the speaker. I did not look at anyone. I focused on the space just beyond the table, on nothing at all. It was easier that. The silence stretched, long enough to become uncomfortable, then longer still. It was not an absence of sound. It was a presence, dense, pressing, expectant. Eventually, someone cleared their throat. The sound broke the tension slightly, but not enough. A chair shifted. Another man leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his hands folded together. The decision remained untouched, sitting between them like an object no one wanted to pick up. No one asked for clarification. No one suggested alternatives. The words had done their work. In that moment, I understood the true nature of the room I was standing in. It was not a place where choices were debated. It was a place where inevitabilities were given language. And as the silence slowly gave way to movement, I knew with absolute certainty that nothing said after this would matter nearly as much as what had already been spoken. The meeting did not end right away. That too felt deliberate. There were a few practical remarks afterward, delivered in the same neutral tone as everything else, but they no longer carried weight. The real moment had already passed. What followed was process. Necessary, orderly, almost polite. It served as a buffer between the decision and its reality. When the door finally opened, the air from the corridor rushed in, cooler and less contained. It felt intrusive. The room emptied gradually, not all at once. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Papers were gathered. Jackets were adjusted. Each man departed with the same controlled expression he had arrived with, as if nothing essential had shifted. But it had. I remained behind briefly, as I often did, waiting for instructions, waiting to be dismissed. The unopened document was finally taken, folded, placed into a folder. I noticed the care with which it was handled. Not respect, distance. As if touching it too directly might transfer responsibility. Outside, the building resumed its rhythm. Messengers moved along the corridors. Doors opened and closed. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed at something trivial. The sound felt wrong in my ears, out of place against what had just occurred. The first signs came quietly, a message sent sooner than expected, a routine request marked with unusual urgency. A familiar pattern altered just enough to draw attention if you were watching closely. Most people were not. They saw continuity where there was, in fact, deviation. I carried instructions to another office. The words were familiar, but their timing was not. The man who received them paused before responding, his eyes lingering on the page longer than necessary. He did not ask questions. He nodded and signed wherein. As I left, I saw the hesitation he did not voice. It mirrored my own. Hours passed. Or perhaps it was less. Time began to feel imprecise, as it often does when awareness sharpens. Conversations around me continued as usual. but there was a slight misalignment to them now, a fraction of a second too long before replies. A carefulness where there had once been routine. No alarms sounded. No immediate disruption announced itself. That was not how consequences arrived. They came through absence. Through things not happening when they should have. A scheduled exchange was delayed. A report arrived incomplete. A request for confirmation went unanswered longer than protocol allowed. Each instance alone meant little. Together, they formed a pattern. I found myself watching faces again, looking for recognition, for the moment when someone else would realize that the order given earlier had already begun to assert itself. Some did. They said nothing. By evening, the building felt different, not louder, not quieter, just altered, as if the walls themselves were aware that they were now holding a different kind of history. I passed by the room where the decision had been spoken. The door was closed. Light spilled faintly from beneath it, though no one was inside. The space had already moved on, preparing itself for the next necessity. Standing there, I understood that the consequences were not waiting somewhere in the distance. They were already unfolding, and no one was going to announce them when they arrived. I carried that moment with me longer than I carried the uniform, not as a memory I revisited often, but as something quieter, heavier. It settled into the background of my days, shaping how I listened, how I watched rooms fill and empty, how I learned to recognize silence before it announced itself. Years passed. The war moved on, as wars do. Lines shifted, names changed. New decisions were made in new rooms, by new people who believed, as the others had, that control could be maintained through language and order. I was no longer close enough to hear those conversations. That distance did not bring relief. What stayed with me was not the outcome. Those details became blurred with time, but the exact weight of that silence after the words were spoken. The way no one looked at anyone else. The shared understanding that something irreversible had just been allowed to exist. I have replayed that instant more times than I can count, though never deliberately. It surfaces on its own, in quiet places, in moments where a pause lasts a fraction too long, in rooms where people wait for someone else to speak first. I sometimes wonder if the others remember it the same way, if they recall the room tightening, the air changing, the feeling that the future had been narrowed without anyone naming what was lost. Or if, for them, it dissolved into paperwork and dates and justification, it easier to. For me, it never became orderly. I remember realizing, long after, that my silence had not been neutral. That standing still, saying nothing, doing what was expected of me, that was also a form of participation. Not heroic, not villainous, just present. There is a temptation, with time, to imagine different versions of oneself. A version that spoke, a version that disrupted the moment. But that is not who I was in that. I was there to observe, to hear, to understand before the consequences made themselves visible, and I did understand. That knowledge has followed me into places that had nothing to do with war, into ordinary conversations, into moments where decisions were framed as necessary and questions were quietly discouraged. I learned, early, what necessity can justify when no one insists on naming its cost. The room itself no longer exists as it did then. Buildings change, they are repurposed, stripped, rebuilt. But I am certain of one thing. The silence remains, in some form, wherever decisions are spoken and immediately accepted. I was there when everything changed, not because I acted, or influenced, or resisted, but because I heard the words the moment they became real, and did nothing to stop them. That is the part that does not fade.